we greet you as a leader who has identified herself with many issues which are of major concern to the British Jewish community. I rise to extend a most warm welcome to the Right Honourable Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister.
Last month, Mrs. Thatcher became only the second Prime Minister to address the Board of Deputies of British Jews in its 230-year history.
What pleases me most is that the qualities which we so admire in Jewish people, the high achievement, the generosity, the sense of community and of helping each other, are those which we have begun to recreate in this country.
In a way, the occasion epitomised the alliance between much of Anglo Jewry and Thatcherite conservatism. A community 750,000 strong, for many years aligned with the political left, is now wedded to the radical right. Dr. Jonathan Sacks, the next chief rabbi, the spiritual leader of most British Jews, sees this perhaps as inevitable.
There is a kind of natural transition, I suppose, with any immigrant group as it becomes more integrated and moves up the social ladder, that it sees its political affiliations moving towards a party that seems to defend the status quo rather than challenge it.
The Jews are no longer newcomers, but part of the establishment and welcomed as such. Lord Young, Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party, was once one of 5 Jewish members of Mrs. Thatcher's cabinet.
The Jewish people, when they came into this country first, were of course very poor, and I suppose their natural affinities were to the left. But you know, anybody can see the error of their ways, and as the decades went by, we saw the error of our ways, and we moved towards the Conservative, which is not the right, which is actually the soft centre, in fact, because even the much vaunted Thatcherism still has a welfare state that's greater today than it's ever been before, and still keeps all the safety net under people.
Not that all Jews relish the conservatism brought on by prosperity and assimilation. Rabbi Julia Noiberger, a Liberal Democrat and leading figure in Reform Jewry, is uneasy about the way in which the community romanticises its past.
Certainly the Jewish community has become wealthier. I think it has become very much more complacent. I think that the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren of the people who come only look romantically at the places that their families came from and don't actually think about the squalor and the poverty and the horrors of it. They just simply are not aware of what they come from in terms of deprivation, and for that reason they don't recognise deprivation that others suffer. With wealth, with comfort, with ease, with, in fact, a strong entrepreneurial tradition, a great business tradition, making it on your own, which they've had to do historically, they really like the view that says, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, nobody helped us.
The immigrant influx, escaping the pogroms, flooded into Britain in the quarter of a century after 1880. For every one who settled in Britain, another 5 moved on, most to America. Nevertheless, in those years, Anglo Jewry trebled in size. It was a community which had only just begun to exercise its political muscle. The restrictions on Jews sitting in Parliament were lifted only in the 1850s. Disraeli got there before then only because his father had converted to Christianity. Geoffrey Alderman, the historian of Anglo Jewry, says it was a matter of honour to long-established Jewish families, such as the Rothschilds, that restrictions against them should be lifted.
The struggle for Jewish emancipation was carried on by a very few very wealthy Jews who felt that for their own status and the status of the community, Jews should have the right to sit in Parliament, although in fact very few wanted to do so.
Nevertheless, almost from the day that the first Jew took his seat, the number of Jewish members of Parliament has been disproportionately high. At the moment there are 22 Jewish MPs when, by ratio, there'd be just 4. It's a matter of some sensitivity that while Jews are well represented in Parliament, the now much bigger Muslim community has never had one of its number in the Commons. But the mass Jewish migration at the turn of the century caused division within Anglo Jewry. Ian Mikado, for many years a Labour MP, is an offspring of the immigrant generation.
Immigrants tend to settle down near the points where they land. Most of them landed, as my father did, in London docks. Now, why were they of the left? Their leftism was anti-establishment. They came from a society in which they were oppressed. That's why they came. Therefore, the authorities were their enemies.
The Jewish communal authorities responded less than warmly to this tidal wave, most of them working class and Yiddish speaking. Many of the most prominent British Jews tried very hard to keep them out.
This largely pauper influx threatened to overturn all that they thought emancipation was about. The paupers from Russia and Romania and Poland were different in manners, different in speech, different in politics. Many of them were very proud socialists and trade unionists. Their very presence in London, in Leeds, in Manchester drew attention to the foreignness, the differentness of the Jewish community. And for many Jews, this was a terrifying ordeal. Jews that were already here felt that their status was in jeopardy.
And these immigrants brought with them doctrines and traditions, anarchism, secularism, which were entirely alien to the established community.
They were anti their own establishment, anti the rabbis and the lay leaders of the community. It's fascinating that nearly all Yiddish literature is about honest proletarians getting the better of their bosses. And the first ever song of the class struggle, and the best song still to this day, is a Yiddish song.
Hat geführt, a Bergerlei mit Mist. Heinz ist geworden, a Kapitalist. Hey, hey, der Leu Polizei, der Leu sammeln sich ab, jetzt Straße.
It was through the trade union movement, rather than through any dogmatic socialism, that Jews entered labour politics in this country.
It's a lovely page of the Jewish working class history.
Mick Mindel, who led the biggest of the tailoring trade unions in East London, the main area of Jewish settlement.
When you think of the cabinet makers, the Jewish bakers, and then there were so many other smaller trade unions, trouser makers trade union, waistcoat makers trade union, 25 members, and they call themselves an international tailor society.
The Jewish unions, at first aloof from the main trade union movement, were in time integrated into it. The last of the sectional unions, the London Jewish Bakers, closed 20 years ago with membership down to a dozen. The unions and the Jewish Friendly Society, the Workers' Circle, only recently wound up, offered not just self-help, but self-improvement. Many would have had libraries. For however long the hours in the East End sweatshops, there was a zeal for education and advancement. The anarchists won particular influence because they published Yiddish-language papers. Their lectures were not just about class struggle, but about art and literature, a crash course in adult education. People like Lou Appleton still talk about My Mother the Anarchist. He also remembers the faction fighting within working-class Jewry.
There were the very ultra-Orthodox Jews, there were the communistically inclined Jews, there were the anarchistically inclined Jews, and I can well remember the battles that used to take place between the various sects, and I could often hear the Central Committee at work behind closed doors, but you could hear tables being thumped and the shouts as people disagreed with each other.
But by the late 30s, with mass unemployment and the menace of fascism, it was communism which commanded the loyalty of many young working-class Jews in the East End.
We lived in a semi-ghetto, and the Communist Party was an intellectual, emotional ghetto of its own.
Sir Alfred Sherman's political peregrination mirrors in exaggerated form that of Anglo Jewry as a whole. The son of a Labour councillor and 10 years a communist, he went to fight in the Spanish Civil War. 40 years later, he became one of Mrs. Thatcher's closest advisers. The man who once machine-gunned the right is now one of them.
The Jews who joined the Communist Party were, for the most part, people who did not feel anything positive. Jewishness meant foreignness, it meant speaking bad English, it meant being an alien. And therefore you tried to get away from that. And by joining the Communist Party, by being a communist, you felt you ceased to be a Jew. You were a member of a worldwide movement in which you were no longer a Jew, you were a person, a communist. It was only later you realised that you simply joined another Jewish faction.
Sir Alfred remained a communist long enough to see, in the 1945 general election, perhaps the most Jewish constituency in the country chuck out its sitting Jewish Labour MP in favour of a communist, Phil Piratin.
I never competed for the Jewish vote with anyone. I never spoke as a Jew. Of course, in fact, though I don't deny it, and I have no reason to be worried about it, I was born Jewish, I was brought up Jewish, but I gave up my religion as a matter of my serious thinking. And when I spoke just as an ordinary East London chap, neither Jewish nor anything of the kind.
But communism faded quickly and almost completely, and after the war the parties of the centre and the right, which had retained the support of a significant number of Jews in the 20s and 30s, appeared to have little to offer. Professor Ivor Crewe.
The Conservative Party was identified as the party that appeased Hitler, and it was still identified as locally as the party of what you might call tennis club anti-Semitism. And that was one reason why certainly middle-class Jews were less inclined to vote Conservative at the time. They regarded the Conservative Party as part of the establishment. They were not part of the establishment. They were still part of a minority subject to prejudice, and so they were a bit reluctant to vote Conservative.
It was the Labour Party which harnessed the support of Anglo Jewry. The 1945 election marked the high point in that association. 26 Jewish Labour MPs were returned, not one Jewish Conservative. Few were community leaders or indeed represented seats with a large Jewish population. Nevertheless, the link between Jews and socialism was there for all to see. Now there are twice as many Jews on the Conservative benches of the Commons as on the opposition side. Ian Mikado, one of the 1945 Labour intake, offers a typically materialist explanation.
Whilst the majority of Jews in 1945, and I would think in 50 and 51 and 55 and 59 voted Labour. Since then there has been a considerable shift over to the Tories, and I'm afraid the explanation is a crude, basic, simple one. It is the rise of Yappydom. The Jews have more than their fair share of Yappies.
By the 50s, Professor Alderman says, Anglo Jewry was no longer a mainly working-class community.
The Jews moved up and out. They moved up the social scale, and they moved out of the inner-city Labour heartlands.
And Mick Mindle witnessed at first hand the decline of the Jewish tailoring trade in the East End.
The Jewish working class began to move away from the 50s. I think when the boys came back from the war, there was an entirely different approach to the industry. Many of them decided to leave and become taxi drivers. Loads became post office workers. They wanted to work in an industry which gave them a pension. It was a complete change.
But the drift to the right was more than simply a matter of social class. Phil Piratin says Jews, chastened by the experience of anti-Semitism, clustered anxiously together in the comfortable suburbs of North London. He recalls meeting a couple who had once been fellow communists.
She at one point said, "We now live in Edgware. Everyone in the street is Jewish." And my wife said, "You mean you live in a ghetto like your grandparents escaped from?" They had been members of the Communist Party, and she seemed to be happy, I won't say proud, that everyone there is, therefore they had no trouble with their neighbours. This is a derivative of fear.
And the ideology of Jewish nationalism, or Zionism, hitherto far from widely accepted among British Jews, gained a new attraction as the scale and horror of the Holocaust became apparent.
When that came out, it shook people. And I would say that when that happened, and simultaneously the struggle was going on to establish the State of Israel, many people who basically were non-Zionists, whether they were on the left or anything else, they could have been liberal-minded people, began to say, well, it would be good if the Jews had a national home.
In my younger days, I was very left in my views, but later I became, and still am, a very ardent Zionist, so that I'm a peculiar mixture, you see. I started off under the influence of the anarchists and then the left, and now I suppose people would say I've gone full circle.
Lou Appleton was one of many for whom Zionism didn't simply supplement their socialism, it superseded it.
The odd thing is that when the State of Israel was declared, a lot of the hostility which has existed in the workers' circle against Zionism almost disappeared overnight, and they became very, very much workers for the establishment of the State of Israel. And in fact, they raised money to help establish places even before it was Israel, when it was still Palestine.
During the war, and specifically after the war, the sympathy of the Jewish community was with the embryonic state of Israel. There's no question about that. And they had this great pride in it and this great excitement. And look what's been reborn out of the ashes. Then to find that the Labour Party was increasingly negative about it. I mean, originally, you see, there was quite a lot of support for the State of Israel within the Labour Party, but that changed, and it changed rather dramatically. And in recent years, there has been an increasing anti-Zionism. When you get the extreme anti-Zionism that you get from parts of the Labour left, you actually do have a tinge of anti-Semitism in it.
Labour's ambivalence towards Zionism was evident within months of the party's triumph in the 1945 election. The Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, announced that any future Jewish immigration into what was then still Palestine could only be with the consent of the Arabs. Sir Alfred Sherman, then still on the left, remembers the sense of shock.
I think the effect of Bevin was that they destroyed the Jews' illusions that Labour was pro-Israel. They realised they hadn't many friends. This didn't make them conservative, but played a part because the argument, well, Labour is pro-Israel, pro-Jewish, was blown apart.
And Labour's condemnation of the Suez operation in 1956, when Israel, with the collusion of Britain and France, launched an ill-fated military operation against Egypt, further weakened the bonds with Anglo Jewry. Richard Crossman, a leading figure in the party, recalled a few years later the anguish of Labour Zionists.
You see, I was against the party on Suez, and it was, for those of us who were pro-Israel, far the most ghastly time. And when I look back to 1945 to 1948, the period of the fighting with Bevin, 48 to 50, the period of the foundation of the state, there were no crises in our relationships which tore us in the way that Suez did.
The perception remains among most Jews that Labour is the less friendly of the two main parties towards Israel. Ivor Crewe insists this is an important factor in determining the political allegiance of British Jews.
If you ask yourself the question, why is it that Jews in the United States, very prosperous, why is it that they still, in overwhelming numbers, support the Democratic Party, the party of the underdog, whereas Jews in Britain, who have also prospered, but not to the same extent as the United States, have shifted very much towards the Conservative Party? One reason, I have absolutely no doubt, is the difference between the Labour Party's attitude to the Middle East, starting in the 1940s, as opposed to that of the Democratic Party of the United States, which has always been solidly, some people would say slavishly, pro-Israeli.
As for Mrs. Thatcher, she's certainly not been slavishly pro-Israel, but the Jewish community was delighted by her 1986 visit to Israel, the first by a serving British Prime Minister. They've applauded her outspoken defence of Soviet Jewry. Some would say Mrs. Thatcher's staunch support for Israel is the main determinant of how Jews vote. Not so Lord Young, until last year one of Mrs. Thatcher's closest cabinet colleagues.
Oh, utterly irrelevant. If anything, I suspect that most Jews in this country who are very much pro-Israel would be against the government. So no, I wouldn't. I think we must be very careful not to let this myth grow up that somehow Margaret Thatcher is far too Jewish supporting or supporting of Jews, or that this government is.
But it is conspicuous how much Mrs. Thatcher has turned to Jews as advisers and as ministers.
Mrs. Thatcher has always surrounded herself with really a surprising number of Jews. And I'm not only talking here about the number of Jews who've been in her cabinet, although that has been quite a lot, but of some of her advisors, whether you're talking about Saatchi and Saatchi, or Alfred Sherman, or Lord Young, who before he was a cabinet minister was an advisor. And Jews who read the Jewish Chronicle, for example, will have simply noticed how, year after year, Mrs. Thatcher seemed to actually welcome the presence of Jews around her, to depend on them.
She's also the first Prime Minister to represent a seat, Finchley in North London, with a large Jewish population. She's made a point of visiting all Finchley's 19 synagogues. Sir Alfred Sherman says she's a great deal in common with the local Jewish community.
She is an outwardly mobile, lower middle class person, and much in common. She is dealing with Tories, many of whom are rather snobbish, whereas the Jews are not. You find many more similar to her among her Jewish constituents in Finchley than among her English constituents.
Mrs. Thatcher quickly tackled the local petty anti-Semitism, and under her leadership the National Party has become more of a meritocracy, less of a gentleman's club. The new party of estate agents and accountants is perhaps more welcoming to Jews than the old dominance of landed gentry and political dynasties. Certainly Ivan Lawrence, a Conservative MP and member of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, acknowledges that at one time aspiring Jewish politicians were not made to feel over-welcome in the party.
Yes, I think there was probably something in that in the years before and after the war, a certain reluctance to have anybody represent you who wasn't Church of England. I think the same thing applied to Catholics and probably applied to Jews. I think that has mostly been overcome now, and I don't think associations are as concerned as they were to have Church of England people representing them. I'm sure many of them would prefer to, all things being equal, but very often they're not equal, and they bear no ill will towards somebody of a different religious creed like Judaism.
In a sense, Mrs. Thatcher is the model Jewish leader. Her sympathy with the small businessman rather than the big corporation chimes with Jewish social composition. Her Methodist emphasis on self-reliance, social discipline and the family is very much in tune with Jewish social teaching. Nevertheless, the way in which the present Chief Rabbi, Lord Jacobowitz, has appeared to endorse much of Mrs. Thatcher's social policy, the way in which she has reciprocated, most obviously by making him appear, has been remarkable. She has expressed lavish praise of Lord Jacobowitz in a way she would never do of the Archbishop of Canterbury.
I would like to pay a particular tribute to the Chief Rabbi. He's absolutely marvellous and always speaks up fearlessly on everything.
I believe that there are many teachings of my faith that may be more consonant with the needs of the times than they might have been 10 years ago or 20 years ago. I believe the permissive society has had its day. There is a search, a groping today for more stable values. And to the extent that what I have to say happens to coincide with government policies, then so be it, and I'll support it.
Lord Jacobowitz's writings on the inner city, urging that the present-day disadvantaged learn from the Jewish experience and find their salvation through their own hard work, have been described as the most blatant act of political partiality by a chief rabbi for the best part of a century. But the man who will next year take over the office, Jonathan Sacks, says this is not political preference, but a statement of Jewish teaching.
There is something very deep in the Jewish tradition which is critical of state power as such. And that flows from a deep respect that we have for the dignity of the individual and for the moral responsibility of the individual. And I suppose that's really what Lord Jacobowitz picked out in Margaret Thatcher's political programme. And it does have echoes in the Jewish tradition.
But Jewish critics of Lord Jacobowitz accuse him of political innocence, or worse. Rabbi Julian Noiberger has crossed swords with him on several occasions.
I'm extremely embarrassed that the Chief Rabbi is regarded as Mrs. Thatcher's favourite cleric. I think that it is very damaging to the Jewish community that the Chief Rabbi, who is regarded as the representative of all Jewry, even though he's actually not, that he should be associated with one particular political view seems to me to be extremely worrying. But it is quite clear that the Chief Rabbi is deeply associated with Thatcherite-type conservatism. There are different Jewish views about how you alleviate poverty. There are different Jewish views about what you have to do. I don't think that what he says is representative of Judaism. I think it's representative of him.
And Jonathan Sacks, when he becomes Chief Rabbi, may well learn from the controversy and consciously seek to avoid any political label. Indeed, he insists that the Jewish community is not quite so won over to Thatcherism as is generally imagined.
They're not as strongly identified with the Conservative Party as the media would have us believe. Many of them still remember socialist roots in the East End, and they see that not as a matter of self-interest, but as a matter of that passionate concern for the underdog, for the underprivileged, the disenfranchised, which is at the very heart of prophetic Judaism.
But it cannot be gainsaid that Anglo-Jewry is generally on the right. The long liaison between Jews and socialism is all but exhausted. Will it ever be resurrected? Ivor Crewe, with a weather eye on the rising tide of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, says, however unlikely, that can't be ruled out.
I think it is quite possible that as socialist forces in Eastern Europe regroup, and no doubt some of them recover, they will come to be seen as the parties in Eastern Europe that stand against anti-Semitism, whereas the parties of the right in Eastern Europe are going to be the parties that are associated with anti-Semitism. And in the long term, this might lead to a revival of that assumption that was so important in the 40s and 50s, that parties of the left could be relied upon to side with the Jewish minority, whereas parties of the right were tainted by fascism.
But for the time being, most British Jews remain loyal to Mrs. Thatcher. And Geoffrey Alderman wonders whether the day will come when the identification of much of Anglo-Jewry with conservatism will turn out to be not a blessing, but a burden.
The perception is that the Jewish community is putting its eggs in a basket which might not have many years of life left in it.